Lisa mentioned the Buddha and Ananda, and we've got the picture there. So I'm going to say a bit about. This is just picking out two famous phrases from the Parinirvana Sutta, sometimes also called the Buddha's Last Days, and a couple of general points to make that we can, ideas we can have which aren't quite right. One, I suppose, is that the Buddha was rather soft. He was very kind to everybody, so that meant he was rather soft with people. And another one was that he lived in a wonderful land where everything was like a sort of Shangri-La, a beautiful realm where all the difficulties we have today weren't there. And of course, neither of those things is true. So one of the things at the beginning of the Parinirvana Sutta is one of the local kings is planning to go and attack this other people, the Vajjayans. He's going to go and bash them, and that is talked about in the sutta. So as always, there was a certain amount of power struggle and things like that going on at that time, and political instability and difficulty and people grabbing power and then losing power. That was always going on around. Also, the Buddha, he was extremely kind and compassionate, and fortunately, unlike unenlightened people, he had no ego and he had no anger. But if he felt someone if he wanted to point out to somebody that they'd got the wrong idea, he would just calmly tell them that. And certainly Ananda was one of the people who he often calmly told, no, Ananda, you've got that wrong, and this is what's correct, But he wasn't promoting his own ego. So we've heard about Ananda. It's very much associated with things like spiritual friendship, which is something our movement is very keen on, So we generally, obviously people do what they wish at the classes, but it's great if we're not simply coming to an evening class and then going home, and it's great if we can make friends, get to know people. That's certainly part of the practice of being a Buddhist in our movement, is to make friendships and to get to know each other and help each other along the way of practicing Buddhism. If we decide we are a Buddhist, sometimes people come to the centre and realise I'm not a Buddhist after all, and that's up to them, of course. Hopefully they've got something from coming to the centre, Okay, so as I mentioned, at a certain point, Ananda feels overwhelmed by this realization that the Buddha's earthly life is coming to an end. There's another passage which is quite interesting, where they're in a little place called Kusinara, and a few years ago some of us were on a pilgrimage there. I know Bodhivangsa was there, and I was there. Was anyone else on that trip? yes, yeah. And Virimati as well. And it's still a quite out-of-the-way place, isn't it? But more Buddhists go there to see the place where the Buddha's Parinirvana occurred. But it's still out-of-the-way place. And one of the things, Ananda, this is a very human trait, isn't it? He didn't like the fact that he was contemplating the fact that the Buddha was going to no longer be with him. So he said to the Buddha, why are you wanting to die in this place? You could be in a beautiful city, why be in this miserable little place, with these mud huts in the middle of nowhere in the back of beyond, And in fact, the Buddha says to him, well, no, actually this used to be a very beautiful city, and that city came to an end, impermanence and all that. He said, but don't just blame the place we're in now for the fact that this is happening. But I think we quite often do that, don't we? If we're not liking our experience, we tend to think this place I'm in now is a real dump. I don't like it. And it's often it's something a bit more internal than that. That's something to talk about in the study group, whether people ever experience that, or the discussion group. So here are three different translations then of something that happened just after that. This is when Ananda becomes overwhelmed by the thought of the Buddha's Parinirvana. And it seems to always be a thing that he's leaning in some way on the doorpost or sometimes the lintel Some people say, I think a lintel is the top bit of a door. Is it? Is that right? Anyone? Yeah. So some people said, no, he would have to have been about 8 feet tall to do that. Sometimes it said the vihara, which can mean a monastery, but of course there weren't any monasteries in the time of the Buddha. People lived in huts, really, temporary dwellings. Most of the bhikkhus and bhikshunis, his followers. The big splendid monasteries came later when Buddhism got more established. But 3 different versions of what happened. So this is, and the venerable. This is from a translator called Maurice Walsh. And the venerable Ananda went into his lodging and stood lamenting, leaning on the doorpost. Alas, I am a learner with much to do, and the teacher is passing away, who was so compassionate to me. That's one. And then another one from Thomas Rhys Davids, who I've been particularly interested in because I first went to classes in Colchester, where Harsha Prabha and Bodhisattva were involved 30 years ago. And I only recently found out that Thomas Rhys Davids grew up in Colchester. To me that was quite a big thing, because he also he coined the term enlightenment as well, because the word Bodhi can be translated as awakening, but he translated it as enlightenment, and that seems to be the one that caught on more. So this was in about 1910. He translated this. So he died in 1922, I think. Now the venerable Ananda went into the vihara and stood leaning against the lintel of the door and weeping at the thought, alas, I remain but a learner, one who is yet to work out his own perfection, and the master is about to pass away from me, he who is so kind. That's another version. And at the risk of being boring, here's the third one. So if you ever want to look at any of these early things in Buddhism, there's a website called Access to Insight, and you can get most of these things on there. They're particular versions of the stories. So this one is a translation. It's been done by 3 people. Sister Vajira, who was apparently a German lady who died in the 1990s but studied in the East. Francis Story, who was an Englishman who died in the 70s and spent a lot of time in the East. And Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who trained in a particular Thai tradition, but he's an American. He's also known as Arjan Jeff, because his first name is Jeff, So, but their version that those 3 came up with is, then the venerable Ananda went into the vihara and leaned against the doorpost and wept. I am still but a learner, and I have to strive to my own perfection. But alas, my master, who was so compassionate towards me, is about to pass away. So they're not massively different, are they? But perhaps one of the differences is between translating something as compassion or as kindness. So I suppose kindness, you've got words like metta, you've got words like daya, the part of my name is to do with kindliness. And another word is karuna. Karuna tends to be applied particularly where people are definitely suffering. So if somebody is definitely suffering and you're sending them something like metta, it's karuna, it's compassion, But the words are closely related. Something that some people may know, though, the word in the sutta is anukampa, and that literally means trembling with, or vibrating with, or emotionally resonating with. So it's almost as though what Ananda is saying is that the Buddha kind of, we were very emotionally attuned to each other, and he was very, very kind and very positive in that. So it's interesting, isn't it? That's one way of I suppose we tend not to quite say it like that, do we? Talk about emotional resonance. I suppose in the West we perhaps talk about, this friend, we were very close, so we talk about it in terms of physical closeness or something, rather than, we sort of vibrated with each other or resonated with each other in a certain way. But it's just a different way of putting it. General question, which do you prefer? Quite often we do tend to prefer the one we heard first, or the one that hits home for us, but that's something to talk about. Of course, Ananda actually never said "he who is so kind" or "he who is so compassionate to me," because he wasn't speaking English, of course, and it's always worth saying that. So you can't completely nail down what he said. Equally, translation is difficult, of course, isn't it? Ideally, you've got somebody who knows the language very, very, very well, and who also is a bit of a writer. They can draw out the telling phrase and that kind of thing. And not every, some people who can do the literal words well can't always just make it something that's actually readable and that has an emotional effect. Another debate has been about the Buddha's final words. By the way, the language, although it's said that sometimes you can go to the East and people tell you the Buddha spoke Pali. That's the language he spoke, and then there was Sanskrit also in there, the two languages that we often quote from. Apparently, the language he actually spoke was called Magadhi Prakrit. So, which it's not hugely different apparently, although again it's somewhat lost, and of course it was before a lot of things were written down much. But apparently it's considered to be sufficiently different to Pali to be a different language or a different dialect. But don't worry too much about that, So the Buddha's final words in Pali are Vayadharma Sankara Apamadana Sampadeta. And that translates, Maurice Walsh says it's, all conditioned things are of a nature to decay, strive on untiringly. Rhys Davids has it as, decay is inherent in all component things. Work out your salvation with diligence. This was in 1910. Or the Access to Insight translation is, all compounded things are subject to vanish. Strike with earnestness. So those are three. Now, a popular rendition is, all conditioned things are impermanent, with mindfulness strive on. So that's probably the one that we hear the most. I think the idea is that everyone in this room, we've arisen through certain conditions, haven't we? Our parents had to meet each other. Somebody brought us up and fed us and looked after us, and then something attracted us to the Buddhist Centre, and here we are on this particular day. We'll never actually, as I often say, we'll never actually have this particular assembly of people ever here again, very unlikely, because so certain conditions or mean that certain things happen, but they come into being and then they stop. So I've come into being, but at some point I will cease to exist in this form. So I'm kind of compounded or conditioned by the conditions that have been there to cause me to be in this particular form that I am. But the general idea is that in enlightenment, something changes. The person, it's not that the conditions don't apply at all, but something changes. To give a full account of that, would require to be enlightened oneself. So, a bit like with the turtle and the fish, and the trying to describe what it is to be on dry land. Yeah, so with mindfulness strive, all conditioned things are impermanent with mindfulness strive on. There's a couple of talks on Free Buddhist Audio. One by Dharmacharini, that's a female order member, Svadi. And there's a talk by Pranyamati, who's one of our male order members, who's a Dharmachari. So in our movement, we're not monks or nuns. We're not lay people. We're sort of somewhere where we are. We're neither sort of lay people in the sense of, the ordination hopefully takes us further with our Buddhism, but we're not leading a monastic life generally. But anyway, yeah. So Svadi was our first Iranian order member. It happens, and I've met her in the past, and she's a dentist by profession. And Pranyamati is an aerospace engineer, and he's last time I don't know him very well, but I think he designed he modifies the wings on Airbuses, So anyway, yeah. So that's one thing it does show, is that our order members do get involved with all sorts of interesting things, and some people have said, hang on a minute, that word apramada or apamada isn't a good translation of mindfulness, because the word mindfulness gets bandied about here and there, doesn't it? A lot more than it used to, and it's a good word, Other translations are smrti, sati, sampajana. There's different meanings for that. One translation of what apramada actually is taking great care concerning what should be adopted and what should be avoided. So I suppose the Buddha was saying the key thing is to realize that with your own, he was saying to the bhikkhus and bhikshunis, remember all things are impermanent, including the Buddha in this particular form. For your own practice of Buddhism, you've got to create the conditions for that to happen. To go out and communicate that to other people, you've got to create the conditions for that to happen. People won't just come rushing to you saying, tell us about what the Buddha did. You've got to, you've got to, and again, with mindfulness strive on, I suppose he was saying that there's an element of effort in that, You could say, in a more skillful, perhaps more ethical way than is sometimes the case, he was a bit like a sports coach, because I think if you went over to the football ground over here, before the match, I think the manager often does remind people, now, please go out there and make a good effort. Do get out there and really try the best you can, and try to prepare yourself for the game, If you go out drinking the night before the game, that you're not creating the conditions for a successful football match, for your team, And just adding here that the real meaning of ancient words can help us to reflect, and it can be part of a genuine search for truth. But other times it can, you do sometimes see the scholars in these books really nitpicking and bashing each other and getting into some quite negative mental states. I'm right, he's totally wrong, and you've got to be a bit careful with that, haven't you? The questions are, I suppose, does this help me to practice Buddhism? And Sangharakshita writing about He Who Is So Kind, saying that half of Buddhism is in that remark, and that this idea of in some way going towards enlightenment and trying to take other beings with you, not going around being hugely evangelical necessarily, probably not, but just perhaps in some way helping others, spiritually as well as materially. So that was it, really. Yeah.